And all of the same problems that we deal with every day in the real world, they have in this fantasy world. They're just, dressed up a little different.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey, Dr. O,
Brandon Sanders,
Robin Mock,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Peter V. Brett.
Today's episode is sponsored by editor Ellen Campbell. Authors, if you are looking for someone to help shape your words into what you originally intended them to be, Ellen can help you do that. Ellen is one of the most sought-after indie editors out today, and she is one of the best. I've used her. So many other people in the community have used her. There's a link to her website in the show notes. I'll be talking more about her as the month goes on. Also, thanks to R.J. Panero, his upcoming book, Avenue of Regrets, is an engrossing psychological thriller coming up in November. We're going to be talking about it more this month and talking with R.J. Thanks to him for sponsoring the show. As always, after the show, there's an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, we've got a show that I am super excited to share with you guys. Linda Strader joins me today. She has a brand new book. It's been out a couple of months, I think, by the time you guys are hearing this. It's called Summers of Fire, a memoir of adventure, love, and courage. Linda, welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Hank. I really appreciate that. I'm happy to be here.
And I am happy to have you here. Before we get into this amazing story that you've written, we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, it's interesting because I never thought of myself as one. When it's kind of, when this book came to me, it really was just more of, I was going through a lot of major losses. I lost my mom, my job, my marriage, and I was having a very tough time. And so I kind of reflected back to the times where my life was much different, and I looked forward to it. I really enjoyed my career as a firefighter, and I just thought, well, maybe I should write down some of my adventures before I forget. So I started doing that. And before I knew it, I had 90 pages, and I shared it with friends, and they said, "Wow, you should do more with this." And then I was talking to my neighbor, came over, my new neighbor, and he saw a collage of my firefighting photos on the wall, and he said, "Wow, you were a firefighter." And I said, "Yeah, And he says, "You should write a book." And I was like, "Oh, I don't know how to write a book. I can't write a book." But I had this thing that was 90 pages long, which wasn't quite a book yet, and so I thought, so all of a sudden I just started writing, and 450 pages later, I had what looked like a book, and I was like, "Oh, I guess I have a book."
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. So let's backtrack a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about, you alluded to, your mother dying and losing your job, your marriage. How had you gotten to that point? You have this really fascinating story of being one of the very first female firefighters, and you've got this grand adventure. I've read through the book, and it's just one exciting thing after another, and you're like, "Oh my gosh, this woman has lived like 5 lives of adventure more than I have." How did you get started pioneering in this area, and tell us a little bit about how you got to there.
Well, I've had a lot of people ask me that question, and most people assume, "Oh, you must have wanted to be a firefighter ever since you were a little kid."
Yeah.
And the answer is no. It never occurred to me.
That happens so
Not
often.
At all.
You just
and basically, I mean, make a long story short, which is actually my second book, is how I actually came about doing this, is that my family was original from Syracuse, New York, and when I was 16, they decided, we hate Syracuse weather, we're moving west. And they uprooted us in the middle of my senior year of high school and moved us to Prescott, Arizona, which was this little tiny hick town in the middle of nowhere. And I was trying to figure out what the heck I was doing there and why. And I always liked the outdoors, so I liked Prescott in that aspect. But being the newbie, nobody was making friends in the middle of your senior year. So I was completely ignored. I had no friends. I couldn't find work, didn't really care if I stayed there. So as soon as I graduated, I got on a plane and I flew back to Syracuse thinking that I was going to stay. And when I got there, I realized all my friends were going to college, and my parents couldn't afford to send us to college, and I had no college plans, no interest, didn't know what I would do anyway. When I realized all my friends were leaving, I thought, well, I guess I'm just going to have to go back to Prescott. I don't have any place else to go. So I went back to Prescott and learned to love it there, but I still couldn't find work. Back in 1972, Prescott had a population of maybe 12,000.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and so for a young woman, 17, 18 years old, you were a waitress, a secretary, or not much else.
Or a homemaker, probably.
Homemaker, yeah, there you go. And I wanted none of those things. And I kept trying to find the job, the one that was interesting, the one that I could make enough money that I could move out on my own. And I couldn't find anything, so reluctantly, I started looking in Tucson. I had some connections down there, and I happened to meet up with someone who said, I have just the job for you. I just happen to know the Forest Service on Mount Lemmon, on the Coronado National Forest, is looking for office help. And I was thinking, office help. But then I'm thinking, but I'm working in a ranger station.
Right.
On the top of Mount Lemmon, which is much like Prescott. I mean, we're talking Ponderosa Pine Forest. So I thought, yeah, I'll do that. And I interviewed that day, and I got the job.
Nice.
And I ended up working as a fire timekeeper for the Catalina Hotshots on Mount Lemmon for 2 summers. And while I was up there, I hated the work. I hated the office work. But I was working in the middle of a national forest. I was meeting up, here I am, 18, 19 years old, meeting all of these single firefighters, and I'm discovering they have a pretty fascinating job. I can do that. I never gave it a second thought that there were no women on the crew. I just figured, well, I want to do it, so I can do it. Right. So I applied and ended up getting a job, not there, but I got a job in southern Arizona in the Santa Rita Mountains down near Nogales. And still didn't get the fact that I was the only woman on the crew, even intentionally so. I mean, I started work, and I on a crew of 10, and there were 9 men, and and I thought, well, yeah, I can do this. So I could figure this out. It's okay.
Like it just didn't occur to you that you were blazing trails. Pardon the pun.
Yeah, exactly. No, and it didn't, and it wasn't until I started working on my book seriously that I started researching. So just when did women start showing up? Because I started finding information of, the Forest Service didn't allow women on fire crews at all until the Equal Employment Opportunity Act was passed in 1972. But there were very few women were hired because of that act, because I started reading how the Forest Service was very resistant to that. They didn't want women. And by 1976, when I was hired, they were pretty much told that they would do it or else.
Wow.
And it wasn't... It didn't occur to me. I mean, I'm adding it all up now that I can look back. I mean, that's when the Federal Women's Program started, and I didn't really understand what that was all about, but it turned out that they had to create this program to help the women that were now having a heck of a time adjusting to being the only ones,
right,
and being the new ones. So yeah, I had no idea what I was getting into, and I just felt the men seemed to. Some of them seemed to resent me being there. Some of them were very verbal about feeling resentful toward me being there and telling me I didn't belong there and I couldn't do the work even though I was doing it. And it wasn't until a couple summers later that I was denied a job for which I was fully qualified, told to my face, you can't have this job because you're female.
Mm.
And now this took on a whole different connotation to me of, it's like, what do you mean? Oh, you can't tell me that. It's like, how could you can't tell me that. And so the more I heard that, the harder I fought them. That I realized, no, I want this job.
Yeah.
And I can do this job. I've been doing it for years, so don't tell me I can't do this job. But I couldn't win because I couldn't prove that they were saying these things to me.
The kind of the good old boy network at work there.
Yeah.
Well,
I found myself blacklisted. Yeah.
Let me ask you this, Linda. You moved from New York to Arizona first, so there's a bit of culture shock, I would imagine, going from
goodness, yeah.
I mean, on many different levels, I would imagine. So, did you already have? I don't want to say a chip on your shoulder because that's not what I mean, but maybe a special determination, after going through kind of this unsettling move and having to start over and find your place or make a place for yourself, as happens often when we move to a new place, and then to move and did you already have this kind of resiliency and this determination because of the move? Were you already in that mindset, or is this just you naturally that you just don't even think of the things that would hold someone else back? It just doesn't come into your mind.
Well, that's an excellent question because it's almost twofold. It's almost both.
Right.
I don't think. I mean, in fact, I had someone ask me to write a guest blog about resiliency because she said, well, if anybody is resilient, it would be you working with the job that you had. And I'm like, oh, sure, I can write this. And I'm looking at the blank page and I'm thinking, I'm not resilient. I've always felt like, wouldn't anybody have done what I did? What makes that so special? So I think part of it was, once I made up my mind I was going to stay in Arizona, I was bound and determined, well, I'm not going to be a secretary and I'm not going to wait on tables, period. I don't want to do that. And so I just kept looking for what I thought would be, I don't want to say unconventional, but I have the feeling that's what I was looking for because some of the work that I did find that usually always turned out to be temporary was rather unconventional. I learned how to silversmith. Nice. And I was making silver and turquoise jewelry for a while. So things like that. It's like, I could look back now and say, yeah, I guess, I was bound and determined that I was going to do something different. Yeah. I certainly never took a job with the Forest Service to prove anything. I just thought the work would be interesting, and I thought it would be different, and I wanted to work outside. That really appealed to me, and I was not afraid of hard work.
I like that idea of pursuing things just because they're different and just because you want to acquire a new skill. I like to think that I'm kind of wired that way, that like I'm pretty good at a lot of things, and kind of excel at a few, but that's because, I'm just interested in, a million different things and I want to know about it and I want to have those experiences. And, I think a lot of people are maybe wired that way, but maybe just scared to, because it goes against the grain of, you need to get a career and settle down and you're going to do this thing for 50 years.
Yeah.
And I just don't have any interest in that. Probably like you.
Yeah, it was one of those things where, I thought the Forest Service was it. That's going to be my job forever and ever and ever. And it didn't happen that way. And I had to reinvent my life several times since then. Yeah. So when people call me resilient, I I'll say, well, I suppose, but I guess for me it's more that, well, I just, if something didn't work the way I wanted it to, then I would try to figure out another way to get it.
Right.
You know, when a Forest Service official told me we are not going to hire you because you're a woman, I applied for a different national forest, thinking, well, maybe it's different someplace else. And I was wrong, but that was my answer to it. Okay, fine. I don't want to work for you anyway.
Right.
I'll go somewhere else.
So what was the pushback that you were getting? Was it just that this is a highly dangerous job? Women maybe don't have the upper body strength that some men have. You're going to fail at the job or put other people in danger. Was that did they even break down why a woman, in their opinion, should not be in the job?
I heard some of that, that you're not strong enough, even though, strength is not an issue with this kind of work. I mean, with any kind of work. In fact, there are women structural firefighters, and their job requires carrying a lot more weight, and it's a lot more strenuous in the sense of carrying weight, but there's still women that do it, and they do just fine.
Sure.
It is, I heard that, one guy, the whole idea of having a woman's presence there, some of the guys worried about me, said, I'm afraid you're going to get hurt. And, and I'm like, well, that's a risk we all take. So, that's why I'm here. I mean, I certainly didn't, want to die, but I did have some close calls, and that was just part of the job, and I never gave it a second thought. So I had two approaches. The one that was a concern for me, because they liked me and they didn't want me to get hurt, and then the other one was, oh, you just don't belong here, you make more work for us, which was never the case. I always pulled my own weight.
So you eventually wound up there against all the pushback, and you started the job. What was that first? What was some of those first experiences when? Did you ever feel like oh my God, this is real? This is people's lives, property are on the line here. Kind of when did the reality, I had some friends, and a nephew that's a firefighter, and it's, we've had these conversations before where, it's all training. It's all, this until you get into the thick of it. And then you're like, oh my God, this is real. What was that first experience like for you?
Yeah, so what happened was we went through 2 weeks of training and just got training done, and we got a fire call. And it just so happened that a lot of the people that lived at the station, I lived at the station, but a lot of other people, they would stay there during the week, but they would go home on the weekends to Tucson. And so as it turned out, everybody left but me and my supervisor, and so it was just the two of us, and here we have a fire call, and he's scrambling trying to get everybody back. But I was kind of surprised at, well, it's going to be at least an hour before they get here, and I'm thinking, an hour? I thought this was an emergency. Where is everybody? So we're just kind of sitting there hanging out, waiting for everybody to show up, and so when we finally get going and we're on the way to the fire and I see the smoke, and I'm thinking, oh, this is the real thing. And this isn't smoke bombs like training. This is real. And I didn't know what to expect. We practiced, but that's nothing compared to when you actually get there and it's burning away and it's, the flames are right in front of your face. But so there was only three of us, and we just started, I just looked at the two people who I thought knew what they were doing, and they said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to start building fire line. You go this way, I'm going that way. And I just started working, and I didn't really think about anything else but working. And building the fire line and getting the fire under control. That was the first thing on my mind. I was not scared. But as the fire season, the first fire season, I only went to a few fires, but in 1977, which was one of the worst fire seasons that had been seen in over 50 years, that was a reality check for me. That's when I saw the biggest fires, the most dangerous fires. I saw homes being threatened in Flagstaff, and we are not trained to fight house fires. And when the first night we got to one that was right outside of Flagstaff, and I was just terrified they were going to make us put out house fires. I thought, can they make us do that? I don't know how to do it. Because now I was worried. And they said, no, you're not going to do that. You're just going to be, watching the line and making sure that the fire doesn't jump the line. But here I am watching fire on one side of me and homes vacated. Experience for me, and I realized how important what I was doing was. It wasn't just saving trees now. Now we were protecting homes, and of course nowadays that's very common, that they're creeping up on houses.
Well, speaking of that, there's this has been a topic in the news this summer, and for just about every summer in recent memory, we see these the stories, especially out west, these wildfires that are getting bigger and bigger and encroaching on residential areas, and it seems like an all summer long story that these things are going on and they're fighting. Is this a new occurrence? I know that you've been working, or you started in the 70s doing this, but is this a new thing that they're ramping up like this, or what do you think some of the cause is of these storied fires?
Well, there's a number of things going on. There's the western drought, and there's the deaths of a lot of forests to the western pine bark beetle, which thrives on trees that are drought stressed. So you have that, and then you have forests that, the reality is that the Forest Service has considered fires bad for like 100 years. Bad, put them all out. And they're discovering that, no, not all fire is bad. You have to have good fires in order to not have conflagrations that absolutely destroy the forest and it will never come back. Because when you have small fires that burn on the ground, they burn out the underbrush, they thin out some of the seedlings so the trees aren't too close together. When you have those kind of fires, they're actually healthy and they actually sustain the forest. You don't lose your entire forest. But when you put fires out and you don't let natural fire do its role of cleaning out the understory, now you have forests that are so thick you can't walk through them. And when they catch on fire, they burn so hot, they burn the tops of the trees, and not just on the ground. So you lose everything, the seed sources for new trees. You sterilize the soil. You get fires that you can't possibly put out. And those are the ones that are happening now, and it's progressively getting worse because it's not that they are encroaching into residential areas, it's that residential areas are encroaching into forested land. So we're building in what they call the wildland urban interface, where you've got homes creeping into what was normally nature and woods and forests, and you combine those with the droughts and the what they call a lack of timber management, a lack of forest management. And people are very resistant to forest management because when they see the Forest Service intentionally set fires and burn them on the ground and try to, get the forest floor clean, all they see is the smoke, and it alarms them.
Well, it goes against our control freak nature too.
We have to control fire. We can't have fire,
Yeah, we can't have fire. It's been going on for millions of years, but we can't let that just happen on its own.
Right, and the other problem is that even if the Forest Service does do prescribed burning, and they're trying to get more of that done, but they don't have the manpower, they don't have the funding, and they barely have the funding to put the fires, to fight the fires that are dangerous, that are out of control. But the reality is, we don't put fires out. we put all these people on them. We drop slurry all over them. And the reality is they don't go out until either it rains or the fire runs out of fuel.
Yeah.
Because slurry does not put fire out.
Yeah. At best, it blunts it a little bit, doesn't it?
It cools it down so a hand crew can get in and build a line. And if there are no crews there, then it's a waste of money.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're in the Forest Service and the on the fire team there, and you tell these stories of your experiences there. Just getting to there was enough of a battle, but when you got there, what was your experience like?
Well, the Forest Service, they're a government agency, and they always reminded me of the military, even though I've never been in the military. But they're very regimented. They have very strict rules, and fire camp is run like an army camp would be on in a war zone. I mean, that's how they treat it, and so there's all these formalities. I mean, you don't just get there and get to go fight a fire. You have to sign in and set up camp, and they have to do all this paperwork now that you're there, and there'll be a lot of waiting before you actually get to do anything. And the waiting part was hard because your adrenaline's all going. You're ready to go. You get called to a fire, and you're like, I want to go. I've got to get there. And then they make you wait for hours and hours and hours. And by that time, you're kind of tired, and you're like, so, it would be this huge, surge of adrenaline to get going, and then when you get there, it all disappears, and then all of a sudden you got to tap into it again, because when you finally get to the fire, then it's like, oh yeah, now I'm here, now I got to start doing something, and now they do work long hours, but gosh, when I first back in the 70s, we would work 24, 36 hours straight sometimes because there was no relief crews, and it's dangerous. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It's dangerous when you put that many hours in because I could just remember. I was on a fire in Northern California for 3 weeks, and I don't remember a whole lot. I remember getting there. I remember some specific incidences that were really scary and that were very, memorable. But the days where we were just kind of trudging out to the fire line and building line all day, I don't remember them. I was so tired that I was just this, zombie of, get up, eat, hike 10 miles to the fire, work for 10 hours, and then hike, 3 or 4 hours to get out. And after a while, you just really don't know what day it is, whether it's day, night, it doesn't really matter.
Well, the book is full of these stories of your remembrances of specific situations and your how you coped with being on the fire line and then your interactions with people. And I don't want to tell all those stories because we want people to get the book, but let's fast forward for a minute to when you decided to write the book. You said earlier that you started collecting these memories and writing down, and before you knew it, you had 90 pages. What was your first intention? Was it to just try to grab all of the memories that you could and then put them in some sort of logical order? At what point did you start seeing the narrative thread that would go through this book and kind of putting it into a specific window into your life?
Yeah, the book originally started out before I even got the firefighting job. I backed up to, I actually started, how did I even get there? And I think a lot of writers struggle with, where do I start my story? And I think I probably changed around the first 3 chapters. I don't know how many times I moved them around, and I'd start here, I'd start there, and I finally decided that to start in the action, start the book when I'm already there, and I do a brief flashback to how I get there, like 2 weeks earlier, and then I just told it chronologically because it made the most sense. I had kept journals. Well, I would say until I was in my 30s. So I had some really, really detailed writing, and I didn't really go to my journals right away because I have a pretty good memory too. So I was writing down things from memory. Oh, I remember the time that oh, and I remember thinking this, so it at first it was just these are the things that happened to me kind of book, which is that's not what a memoir should be. A memoir should be told like a story, like a novel. And it took me a while to get that, to dig into some of the real painful things that happened to me, both emotionally and physically. And I tapped into some things that were very, very hard to write about. And I realized they have to be there. It's part of me, and it's part of what happened, and it's part of the story. And, when it was going, I worked on this book for 6 years, and it was cathartic and yet not. There were times where I thought, okay, I'm going to have to relive this part even though I don't want to. I really don't want to go there. And that's when I started getting into my journals, because I thought I found myself protecting myself. In other words, I would only want to remember so much because it was too painful. And I thought, I think I need to just go to the source. What was I thinking and feeling at the time? And that's where my journals came in really handy, because they were very detailed, and I would write pages and pages and pages about an event and how I felt about it, and I realized there's some really important stuff in there. And I started using my journals more to help me tap into memories that currently, at the time that I was writing it, I didn't really want to do.
Right.
Well, and I had, yeah.
And a lot of times your original idea is kind of wrapped up in the high points, the highlights, the adventures. And, I need to tell these stories of these adventures that I had. And it's really difficult when you start getting down to the emotions that were, below those adventures, or the things that happened between the adventures. And it becomes kind of a different book than you originally intended, doesn't it?
Yes, it did. And very much so. And to the point where, I realized, that I had a lot more to say than I thought I did. And that's where the resiliency came in, when I realized that I met someone early on who online, and we were she's a retired English teacher, and we were writing articles for an online magazine, and we met up, and it turned out she lives in Tucson, which is about 40 miles away from me, and we connected, and she offered, I was telling her about this book I was working on, and she said, well, I'd love to see it. So she ended up helping me with the storyline and helping me edit. And she would catch things. She'd say, it's really, you're not getting yourself enough credit for picking yourself up when other people would have quit. And she said, you're skipping over some really important stuff here. So she would always keep me on track of, you need to think about, what, I said, well, that wasn't important, or anybody would have done that. And she says, no, that's not true. Trust me, it's not true. So it helped, she helped me relate to that better, and my journals certainly helped me tap into some parts where I thought, what, I need this in here. These are parts that need to be in here. It was not easy. What I was doing was not easy, and and yet I just kept. I was so determined that nobody was going to tell me I could not do this job. Right.
Well, I think it's really interesting that you had that friend that helped you find the story in the midst of your stories there. And we think of memoir as this deeply personal thing, and it's you and all you, which is true. But sometimes we need that other set of eyes to help us get a little distance from it, because when you're writing about yourself, sometimes you can't see the forest for the trees. Another horrible pun, I know.
But it's true,
it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. And I, of course, now I've known her for 8 years, and we're very close. And because of this book, I think she knows me better than most people do.
Sure.
Because she tapped, and she would, and she wasn't didn't mess around. There were some things that she would say that I thought were rather harsh, but I'd think about it, and I think, well, I guess you're right.
She's one of those friends.
Yeah, she's one of those who will tell you how it is. And there were sections where I just completely disagreed with her. I said, you know what? I respect your opinion, but this is where I'm going.
Yeah.
And she'd say, okay. So we had a great working. Without her help, I don't think it would have gotten written, because I would get discouraged, and then she would tell me, you've got a good story here, don't give up. And then I would think, well, yeah, you're right. This is crazy. And I had to teach myself how to. I taught myself how to write query letters, how to look for an agent, how to look for a publisher. I taught myself how to accept. Hearing the criticism was not easy, but I learned how to pick and choose between the ones that had value and the ones that didn't.
Well, we were talking right before we started recording about that process and the query letters and dealing with the rejection that comes with writing and publishing so often that you can have a great story and you can believe in the story and people around you can believe in the story, and sadly, the writing of the thing, which seems to be the hardest, is only part of that journey.
Right.
Talk a little bit about, after the book is written and now going through that process of submitting and rejection and submitting and rejection. And, as a writer, who believes in her story, how do you deal with that?
Well, the first thing is that, not everybody wants to go the traditional route.
Yeah.
And I knew I met a local author right when as soon as I started even considering this. First, I wanted to find out, do I have a story worth publishing? And two, if I connect with and find out that I do, which route do I want to take? So the local author I met explained the difference between self-publishing and traditional publishing. She traditionally published, and she suggested I do the same. And after hearing the explanations of why, I decided, you know what, I know it's going to be a really tough road, but this is what I want. And if I can't publish traditionally, then I don't care, I won't publish at all.
What were some of the reasons that you chose traditional? Because there are lots of options for authors now, but there are, benefits and drawbacks to all of them. And it really depends on the book as to what avenue, that book deserves, or sometimes, self-publishing is great for certain genres, but not others, and traditional kind of the same way. What were the factors that swayed you to traditional?
Well, and so we're talking, I started the search, probably 4 years ago, of looking for an agent. The reason, number one, I knew that I wanted the recognition that comes with traditional publishing. Self-publishing has come a long way, but sadly there are a whole lot of books that were self-published that shouldn't be. And anybody can self-publish, but not everybody can publish traditionally. And I wanted the vetting through the industry that would tell me, your book is worth, someone wanted to pay me to publish my book. I didn't pay them, or I didn't pay for it. I didn't have the money anyway. And that was part of it. And I'll tell you, at the 2 years that I spent querying agents and small publishers, when I would get a comment from an agent that was actually personal, instead of, sorry, it's not a good fit for us, and memoirs are too hard to sell. I heard a lot of that. Unless you're famous, nobody buys memoirs anymore, and good luck with that. And I dismissed all of those because there's plenty of proof. Yes, there's plenty of proof that there are memoirs, best-selling memoirs that were written by people that weren't famous, and Cheryl Strayed's book Wild is a perfect example. So, when I would get a rejection letter that said, the first chapter just didn't quite draw me in, I suggest that you revise that or revisit that, and I would take that very seriously. And I would, after I got over the sting of them saying no, I'd think, do they have a good point? And then I would spend, I didn't care how long it took. I didn't care if it would took me 10 more years to get it right. I was going to get it right. Because I knew the story was a good story. I just had to figure out how to put it together so that everybody wanted to read it.
So when you got those helpful comments from agents or publishers, did you take those to heart and go through another revision process using their comments to as constructive criticism?
It did, and it did also come to the point where I was getting better at realizing, taking to heart, okay, what do I want from this? Because I realized I couldn't please everybody. And when I would get one agent would ask for this and another one would essentially ask me to put it back the way it was.
Oh, goodness.
I thought, I'm not messing with this anymore. I'm going to go with what I think works. And I would, and I decided I like where it starts. And if an agent's going to give me a hard time about that, then they're not the right one for me.
Right.
Because you could do that forever. But in the years that I spent doing that, I'll tell you, that's part of the process, and people complain about, well, traditional publishing takes forever. Well, yeah, but when you're done, your book is going to be as good as it can possibly be. Because if I had decided to self-publish and published it early, it would have been a disaster. Looking back, it would have been a disaster. It is 200% better than it was then.
And it's
I wouldn't have known that.
Right. And it's an excellent book. Summers of Fire, a memoir of adventure, love, and courage. This book takes us from about 1976 to about 1982. Is that right?
That during my fire years, and then it does come up to present day.
Gotcha.
It ends in present day.
Gotcha. I highly recommend this book. Linda, you've done a fantastic job of capturing this time and place and bringing us along for an emotional adventure that is deeply satisfying. So I'm congratulations on the book. It's fantastic. I'm going to send everyone to get a copy of it. If people are just learning about you and want to know more about what you do, where can they connect with you online? I know you have a fantastic blog where you write a lot and share a lot of news there. Where can people find you?
Yeah, I have a book called a blog called summersofirebook.blogspot.com. So I'm pretty active on there, and I also have a lot of there's some old photographs there back in the day, and I try to keep up on writing a variety of articles about women in the workplace today and some of the struggles, especially with the Forest Service. There's a lot going on with the Forest Service right now with the Me Too movement, and a lot of women are stepping up and talking about the kind of abuse that they're putting up with. That it's forefront in the news right now, especially with all the fires as well. So that's the best place to find me. I do have an author page on Facebook, and I do post regularly there too on things that I find of interest. In fact, while I was waiting for you to for us to continue our conversation there a few minutes ago, something popped up on Facebook, an article about why fires are much bigger today than they were 40 years ago. I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. And it said exactly what I said, so it was kind of very timely. So
that's awesome.
Yeah, it's my passion still. I'm still really interested, and I'm amazed at the number of women that find me that are working for the Forest Service right now, and they find my blog or they find my Facebook page, and they tell me, wow, I had no idea that you were putting up with that back then, and I would have thought it would have been worse. And I said, you have it a lot worse than I do.
Well,
I think it's worse now.
And that's why we have to share these stories, because it's so many times I think we all feel like we're all alone in this situation or this experience, and then someone else shares their story, and it becomes an empowering thing that, if Linda went through this, 30 years ago, we should be farther along than this by now. And I need to step up and say something because Linda gave me the courage to step up and say something.
And I had a woman firefighter contact me and tell me exactly that. She said, I've read other memoirs by women firefighters. Yours is by far the most honest one I've ever read. And she said, it made me look at my career in a whole different way. And that was just an amazing thing to hear.
Yeah. There's no better compliment than that, is there?
Yeah. No, I was just... I was speechless. I said, oh, my gosh, I really appreciate you reaching out. She's been at it for 5 years, and she says, you make me even more determined to not give this up.
That's fantastic.
Great.
Yeah. Well, the book is called Summers of Fire, a Memoir of Adventure, Love, and Courage. Linda Strader, congratulations on the book, and thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate you having me. It was really a delight to talk with you today.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
On the Wednesday night before Thanksgiving, Joey locked the doors of the Washington Irving Chapel and checked the windows from the outside, making sure that the cemetery offices were dark. Satisfied, he donned a knit cap and trudged uphill to the employee parking lot. He'd forgotten how desolate the grounds became at night. A fog had gathered, blurring the moon and stars. His rusty Volkswagen Beetle, christened Ladybug by Jason, sat in shadow alongside his dad's white van, which bore an image of the horseman and the cemetery's web address. Joey swept a palmful of condensation from Ladybug's windshield and fumbled for his keys. He heard a laugh, high and young. He froze. "Hello?" He shook off gooseflesh and found his key. He started the engine and backed out, headlights off, praying not to knock over a headstone, again. A child stood on the hillside amongst the graves. "You okay, kid? Cemetery's closed." He turned on his headlights. The child vanished. Joey idled in the drive, frowning. What had just happened? He turned off the headlights and waited for his eyes to adjust. The silhouette reappeared. The child stood in the road now, blocking his way. He and the ghost stared at each other. He bit his tongue and squinted over the steering wheel. He couldn't resolve the ghost's features, only a tiny body in ruffles? Yes, a dress. A little girl with shoulder-length hair. The figure crouched, threw its arms over its head and skipped away. A giggle followed after. The ghost skipped up the hill, turned around, and beckoned through the fog. "Please come." Joey shook his head. No way. Ain't gonna happen. But he felt compelled to follow. What could a little girl do to him after all? He would keep a safe distance. The gravel sounded like soft rain beneath his tires. It drew him helplessly, past weeping cypresses and mausoleums blue with moonlight. He followed the giggle, the skipping ribbons, the little body made of shadow and quicksilver. The north end of the cemetery grounds rose to a steep wooded slope. The ghost had led him to Section 77, the northernmost boundary of the cemetery, but he'd lost her. He killed the engine, summoned his courage, and climbed out. The night air brought him fully awake. "Where are you?" he whispered, scanning the graves. A row of diseased hemlock trees stood at the fence line. Joey knew them well. They were dying, infested by some parasite called, he fished for the name, woolly adelgig. His crew had cut them back many times, lopping off limbs and heads, trying to save them. The hemlocks had grown back twisted and tormented. They stood as a row of grotesque sentinels guarding the threshold of the forest. The ghost climbed the slope, spun at the fence, and sat hugging her knees, The black mass of the Rockefeller State Park Preserve loomed behind her. "What do you want?" Joey whispered. "Play." He stepped forward, hands shaking. He just wanted to see her face, the face of a real ghost. To see the curve of her cheek, the sparkle that might have been her left eye. "Come and play, Joey." He froze. The sound of his name terrified him. She pointed over his shoulder. "Play with us." He turned and realized his mistake. He'd driven with his eyes on the girl, trying not to lose her, never looking behind. They had been followed.